Welcome to Dialogue. The European Commission has recently unveiled its white paper for European defense, which serves as the framework for the ReArm Europe Plan. Under the plan, the 27 bloc seeks to mobilize 800 billion euros to bolster defense autonomy by 2030. With its bi-European procurement rules and emphasis on reducing reliance on external suppliers, the plan signals a historic shift towards strategic sovereignty. Yet raises critical questions about internal divisions, ties with NATO, and Europe's capacity to address Ukraine's urgent needs. Against the backdrop of U.S.-led negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, how might these initiatives redefine Europe's role as a security actor? And what would be the immediate and long-term impacts on the situation in Ukraine? Can Europe ultimately form its own security framework without the participation of other nations? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Peter Zalmayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative, and Anton Fadyashin, Associate Professor at American University. And so let's start with the EU's white paper, of course, for European defense readiness 2030. We know the major idea of this, let's say, white paper is about the purpose, is defense autonomy. So via a 150 billion euro loan fund and also 800 billion euros investment plan, prioritizing also EU-made weapons and reducing reliance on the U.S. So Anton, tell us, share with us the background. How does this ReArm Europe plan reflect the EU's strategic shift towards defense self-reliance?
Well, the overall background, of course, is the crisis that NATO is facing in Ukraine and the coming to the White House of the Trump administration, a perfect storm and an absolute nightmare for the European elites. Europe has been very comfortably living underneath the American military umbrella for the past 80 years. It's enabled it to create the high standard of living on our planet. Thanks to that, plus reliable and cheap supplies of Soviet and then Russian gas and oil. But all of that has been coming to a crashing end. First of all, with the war in Ukraine that the Europeans have committed to prolonging as much as they can, and that sucked up an enormous amount of weapons and money. And then the Trump administration came into the White House and essentially has told the Europeans that since they are so concerned about the Russian threat, their military budgets need to reflect it. And so the Europeans have been sort of forced onto a course of independence in terms of their military self-reliance. And that's not a bad thing, by the way, because being completely dependent on the U.S. in terms of the military over the past 80-odd years has really made Europe more of an object of international affairs than a subject, which it rightly deserves. Its population, by the way, is 150 million people, bigger than almost 150 million, bigger than the United States. So it is perfectly capable of standing on its own legs. And so that is the background. Unfortunately for the Europeans, there was no run-up to this. This was all very abrupt and very sudden. And so having lost an enormous amount of time, the Europeans are now catching up. And the devil, as always, will be in the details. And maybe we can talk a little bit later about where exactly this money is going to come from and what that will mean for the future of the EU itself as an organization that sort of unites the governments of Europe.
Yes. We have Peter from Kyiv. Peter, the U.S.-led negotiations with Russia, with Ukraine, is moving forward, but of course without the participation of the European Union. So we see, the 27-nation bloc is forging ahead despite the absence at the negotiation table. They are forging ahead with its so-called steel porcupine strategy. Basically, the purpose is to strengthen Ukraine's armed forces and defense industry to make it a formidable opponent. What is the response from Ukraine? How do Ukraine people look at the response from the EU side? Are they probably doing enough to replace the U.S.?
Well, first of all, let me very quickly take issue with the previous speaker's characterization of Europe as the entity that's prolonging the war. No, the entity that's prolonging the war is Vladimir Putin and his government. I mean, the minute they decide to leave Ukraine, the war will be over, right? Okay, moving on to your question. Europe is talking a good talk, but we're not yet sure if it's ready to walk the walk. With all its pledges, all the good words, all the goodwill, and the understanding that Europe will be the one that will, bear the brunt of a capitulated Ukraine, for example, right? If Ukraine were to capitulate, you're talking about additional millions of refugees spilling over the borders. They're not going to be swimming across the Atlantic Ocean. They'll be going to Poland and Hungary, and then on to developed Western democracies, right? And so the question is, do they have time? Do we have time for the Europeans to reach the consensus that they need to pool resources? They need to, drastically ratchet up their defense spending and get their military industrial complexes working 24/7 the way Russia has done. And there we have a big question. Even after all this that's been said and done by Donald Trump, I'm not yet sure that Europe has finally woken up to the reality. Also, keep in mind, Europe is not a country. It's a coalition of countries. It's a loose confederation. We're seeing problems with the incoming German chancellor. People are leaving his coalition, his party. Macron is, in a few years will have elections, and there's a possibility that a very different party will come to power. So we're constantly, facing these problem of Europe being something that's not homogenous, unfortunately. And once again, Vladimir Putin is not sleeping, is not dozing, it's not taking a break. He's working actively on, co-opting and disrupting the political order of things in Europe. And now we're faced with a very interesting situation where Donald Trump seems to be willing to join forces with Vladimir Putin in enabling and certain right-wing and left-wing disruption forces in Europe.
Well, Peter, at least what we can see is, or what we are seeing is there's a strong pledge, strong political will from the European countries. Obviously, it's not only for Ukraine, but also, in their view, it's for their own security, right?
Indeed, and that's exactly the once again, the leaders have been able to articulate this problem very well, from Ursula von der Leyen to individual leaders of states such as Macron and once again the incoming new chancellor of Germany, the president of Czech Republic, Giorgia Meloni of Italy. Everyone understand what is at stake, but once again, will they pool these resources? Will they be able to convince their population that they need to go to a war footing? That's the expression, you can use with respect to Russia. Putin has been able to do that. He's been able to, keep public discontent with the war under lid. Whether Europeans will be able to sell this idea to their populations is a big question.
Well, Anton, what's your opinion on that? Respect. Do you think the European governments are capable of basically mastering the support from the public, and also, demonstrate solidarity, not only in their words but also probably with action here?
Mustering support, no, they won't be able to do it. And we see the fruits of this in the election results that are rolling across Europe, where conservative parties are coming to power. And it seems that like the geopolitical pole in Europe has switched, because it's the conservatives that are now sort of pushing for diplomatic negotiations, and it's sort of the more liberal parties in Europe, leftist even in some cases, that are willing to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. So mustering this support is going to be very difficult, but enforcing this support is proving successful in some places. So, for example, when the EU recognizes the cancellation of democratic elections in Romania because a conservative candidate who wants a diplomatic solution When that happens, then I think that sends a signal to the rest of the continent that democracy will be marginalized as long as support for Ukraine and for the war will go on. And let me respond to something that Peter mentioned, which is that, yes, the Russian army is operating in Ukraine, but the Russians tried to put an end to what started out as a civil war in Ukraine. They tried it in Istanbul. And the Ukrainians walked away from those talks with the active support of the Biden administration and the British. They tried to do the same with the Minsk II agreement, which would have reincorporated parts of the Donbass back into Ukraine in exchange for neutral status. But so since the sides couldn't reach an agreement, here we are 3 years down the road, and there doesn't seem to be an end to the conflict unless Trump and Putin can somehow navigate between the Zelensky government and the Europeans and bring some kind of order to this chaos.
Well, Peter, I know you have different understanding of the course of the developments. Go ahead. And at the same time, I also, of course, two different understanding versions of what happened. At the same time, I also ask a question. Trump is negotiating with Putin directly without the presence of the Ukrainians, without the presence of the Europeans. Is that acceptable for Ukraine, for the Europeans? Is there anything they can do, to be present at the table?
Once again, if you indulge me very quickly to what react to what Anton has said, as someone who is from the Donbass originally, from a Russian-speaking area of Ukraine, I take serious issue with the characterization of the start of the war in the Donbass in 2014 as a civil war. This was not a civil war. This was an action orchestrated by the FSB in Moscow, and that's how it has proceeded along those lines. There was never a civil war in Ukraine. Okay. Moving on to your question, that actually does go against the very formula that the Biden administration had insisted on. No word about Ukraine, no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. Well, Donald Trump can say, well, we're just speaking to these different interlocutors separately, right? We're meeting with Ukrainians, we're meeting with Russians. There is a fear, and I share it with my compatriots, that Donald Trump, in his haste to proclaim himself a fast and efficient peacemaker and an artist of the deal, will make too many concessions to Vladimir Putin, to where whatever will come out in the end will be pretty similar to a full capitulation of Ukraine, which remains Vladimir Putin's goal in Ukraine. So this haste for Donald Trump to enter history books and to maybe win a Nobel Prize for Peace is creating all sorts of pitfalls, and I'm afraid Donald Trump is it's not that he doesn't know the complexity of this issue. My question is, does he care about this? Vladimir Putin wants to impose this format of Yalta 2.0, right? Big powers deciding the fate of smaller states, and seems to me that Donald Trump at least appears to be playing along with that, and so that is risky. And Vladimir Putin feels that he can run circles around Donald Trump and sort of agree to his peace proposal, but then say, well, let's do it this way. Let's do a temporary ceasefire and a limited ceasefire, and then drag out the time so as to blame Ukraine for ostensible violations of ceasefire. I think Vladimir Putin is feeling pretty confident. And so my question is, if Donald Trump is aware of the game that his more experienced colleague in Moscow is playing.
Well, Anton, interesting, of course, after the phone talks of almost 2 hours between Putin and Trump, obviously, President Putin basically raised the Russian demands that the West halt all military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. But the demands, are quietly, being ignored by the Europeans, basically. They are continuing to provide support to the Ukrainians. Is there any possible impact? Trump or Washington okay with it? Because basically you have different policies, right? The U.S. is somehow applying pressure on Ukraine, where the Europeans are continuing with support to the Ukrainians. Do you see obviously there's a different policy, different attitudes at least. Is there anything contradictory for Washington?
Well, contradictory, absolutely, because Trump is trying to establish peace through the process of dialogue. And I actually agree with Peter about his rushing this thing to the point where it actually plays in the Russians' favor. But the remarkable thing, again, is the European position on this, because just a few weeks ago, we had the Munich peace conference, and on the sidelines, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, said in an interview openly that peace is worse for Ukraine than war. And that reflects, unfortunately, the sort of the position, the attitude of the bulk, although not all European leaders right now about the conflict. So yes, they continue to supply Ukraine with weapons, but as both the Ukrainians and the Europeans have admitted, that is not enough to actually help Ukraine gain an upper hand. As a matter of fact, I don't know of a single serious military analyst who believes that Ukraine can win this war, which is why all talk about victory plans has now disappeared. But even that Ukraine has a chance to achieve a stronger position on the battlefield so that it has an advantage during the negotiations, because I just don't see, with the layout on the battlefield and the Russians almost having expelled the Ukrainian army from the Kursk province, where the Ukrainian front completely imploded, I don't see how that's going to happen. And all of that leaves the Trump administration with one alternative, because the other one is that Trump will decide to go all in behind Ukraine again, but that would make him a Joe Biden 2.0. And so for all of the weapons supplies and the billions, tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, the American administration will end up supporting the losing side in the war. So Trump seems to have opted for the other alternative, which is just to push through and try to get negotiations going. I think he's doing himself a disfavor, as he often does, with his mouth and his Twitter and X and all the other fingers, which is by telegraphing all sorts of promises that he can't keep. But in general, the fact that the two sides are talking to each other is important, although ultimately, of course, the Europeans and especially the Ukrainians, of course, are going to have to be brought into the deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, of course, we have seen the Ukrainians have demonstrated this flexibility and strong diplomatic skills. Let's say in the first round, in the first couple of rounds of negotiation with the Americans, the 30 days like ceasefire. But then, of course, as Anton mentioned, there's a few and fewer talk of victory over the Russians. Do you see this change of attitudes? And also, what is the solution in the absence of U.S. continuous support to Ukrainians?
Well, you hear increasingly from social media commentators, from experts in Ukraine, that we are the only ones we can rely on. Essentially, it means bringing up our military-industrial complex to that level of that is required to be able to withstand such a formidable enemy. That means finally developing and mass-producing ballistic missiles, etc. The question is if we have the time for that. But there is an understanding that we cannot rely on the continuing support by the United States anymore. We are not talking about victory the way we were talking about victory in 2022, reconquering Crimea and then Donbass. There is a realization that this may not be even in our lifetimes. The question is whether there will be an official recognition of the loss of these territories. There is fatigue about the war, but still a healthy majority of Ukrainians are not willing to essentially capitulate to a peace deal which would which would really mean a loss of its sovereignty, a loss of its control of its foreign policy direction, and freedom to join alliances, integrate itself with the European Union, become part of the European Union. Let me just add that on the other side as well, there's fatigue with the war, and a healthy majority of Russians want the war to end. But likewise, the territory is the sticking point, and most Russians will tell you that they are not ready to compromise, in whatever territory that's been gained should stay with Russia. And that's why we're talking about the intractability of this. And that's why the Trump administration is so dangerously naive that this conflict can be solved so quickly.
But let's get back to the European Union. And what are the challenges? We're talking about basically 150 billion loan fund and 800 billion investment plans, almost about like $1 trillion euros in terms of rearming the bloc there. What do you see are challenges, for them to achieve the goal?
So, several here. Number one, I keep reading, especially in the American press. Bloomberg just came out with an article today about the German parliament deciding to unlock funds for this remilitarization. The funds in Europe are not locked anywhere. They do not exist right now. These funds are going to be coming out of two sources. One, the individual EU member governments, which means that they will start cutting on their social programs. This is going to be incredibly unpopular with voters who support progressivist, leftist, liberal parties. Let's call them what we want. That's not important. That's going to be very difficult for liberal parties to pull off. And it's going to create more loyalty and more of a willingness among Europeans to vote conservatives into office, because remarkably, again, this is how the polls have sort of reversed themselves. Conservatives will be seen as people who are putting money into social programs. Now, the other source for this money, which so far is just promises, is going to be bonds being sold by the EU itself. Now, this is something that has never happened before. The EU has never been in charge of defense policy. That has always been the preserve of independent states. I understand from the perspective of Brussels and Ursula von der Leyen that floating euro bonds, not individual, French or Hungarian, but euro bonds, will allow the Brussels bureaucracy to have even more power over European defense than the individual European members have. So from an institutional perspective, if you're sitting in Brussels, this is great news. From the point of view of Europeans living in their countries, things look a lot more complicated. That's number one. Number two, with Europe going through a serious economic slowdown because it chose to cut itself off from Russian energy, the weapons that it plans to produce in the distant future are going to be all the more expensive, because in order to produce anything, you need energy. And the cheaper the energy, the cheaper the product. This goes for everything: tables, spoons, cars, solar batteries, and of course, every kind of weapon. So even if Europe manages to raise this money and increase its production capacity, which they haven't done in 3 years, although they claim that they are horribly afraid of Russia, even if they pull that off, all of that is going to be prohibitively expensive. So there are really a lot of questions about how this is actually going to be implemented once you get past the breathless articles and the promises. Although in general, again, let me go back to what I said earlier today. In general, it is very good for Europe to actually start taking care of its own security concerns. It not only makes it a subject of international affairs again, but it also basically protects it from these swings that, of course, happen in Washington, being a democratic, the capital of a democratic country.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, what about the differences, among EU members? Like Baltic countries or Eastern European countries are more active, obviously, than, say, Western European countries like Italy, Spain, probably. And also there are differences in terms of their relationship with NATO, because most of them are part of NATO, and now they are being, say, sort of like having autonomy, which is different from NATO. So how feasible is that?
That's another issue having to do with this, political economic concept of collective action problem, right? When you have such a motley kind of a assortment of countries with different ideologies that are both members of the EU and NATO, and they have veto power of decisions. For example, in both in EU and NATO, you are bound to have situations where decisions cannot be made, decisions are delayed, funding is not released, decisions are being made hostage to whims of individual players. I'm talking specifically about Slovakia under Robert Fico and Hungary under Viktor Orban, who are open admirers of Vladimir Putin and are his allies, etc. And now they have another ally in the person of Donald Trump. So there's this a certain transatlantic unity of these, of these individuals, and as long as that persists, as long as there's no mechanism within these structures like NATO and EU to deal with these, the bad apples, the Trojan horses within them, they will be imploded, they will be destroyed, and will implode from the inside. Look at Hungary. Hungary still has not lost even the power to vote in the EU, let alone had membership suspended. That tells you that these are increasing. These structures are increasingly out of tune, out of step with the times, are sclerotic, and they better really get their act together if they want to remain relevant and to remain in existence.
Well, obviously there are other challenges too. And Tom, what again ties with the relationship with NATO, for example. They say that ReArm Europe Plan complements NATO, but obviously the focus on autonomy, meaning you are on your own, and they want to reduce their reliance on the U.S. For example, recently they have been purchasing 2/3 of their weapons comes from the United States. They want to reduce that. They want to reduce this, future contract with EU, with the U.S. providers or with the U.K. with some restrictions. Is that possible? How feasible is that plan?
Listen, the Europeans are certainly going to try this, but I don't see how the likes of Donald Trump, or for that matter, any other American president who always puts the interests of American military industrial companies first, how they will agree to this. What the Americans want is the Europeans to put more money into buying American weapons, not into producing their own. And I think that's one of the fundamental paradoxes of Europe becoming increasingly independent militarily, while also hoping that that independence is going to boost European economies. I think the fundamental American interest is for this kind of remilitarization to boost the American economy with European money.
As you said, I would assume Washington is happy to see the Europeans taking action to rearm itself. Of course, if they purchase weapons from Washington, that would be the best. But then, if they insist on doing it on their own, purchase like Europeans instead of U.S. weapons or U.K. weapons, because they are looking at the long-term relationship with the U.S. Probably there's a distance there. So what's the strategic impact, on relationship with the U.S. or probably with the U.K. or with other countries?
Again, another paradox of Europe becoming more of a subject, in other words, an independent sovereign actor on the world stage, is that the United States will slowly disengage from Europe. Now, I don't mean by that American bases are going to close down and that the United States will completely turn its back on Europe. That will never happen. But listen, the pivot to Asia is not a Trump-era policy. It was started by Barack Obama, and it is a long-term strategic policy. And I think the Europeans realize that the Americans mean business, that they will be transferring their attention to South Asia and to the Far East, to the Far East of Eurasia, and that Europe will have to stand on its own and rely less and less on the United States, except if it wants the United States to stay as an active participant in NATO. The Americans will insist on the Europeans spending more rather than less of their money buying American hardware rather than European one.
Or being part of NATO. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.